Mark Wilson, a billionaire CEO who prided himself on his business savvy, thought he was just having a little fun when he asked a black waitress for financial advice. He didn't expect Sharon Rosier, an unassuming black woman in a crisp black apron, to hit him with the kind of response that could rival any investor in his circle. When she spoke, Mark felt the familiar sense of control slip from his fingers. He had no idea that her simple words could change everything for him. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're watching from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Now let's continue.
The gleaming chandelier overhead cast a soft, golden glow across the white linen-covered tables of one of the city's most exclusive dining establishments. In the corner, where shadows and light mingled like old acquaintances, sat Mark K. Wilson, an enigma draped in casual attire. His hoodie, emblazoned with the logo of the underground band Idols, clashed with the surrounding opulence of the restaurant. The waiter in the crisp white jacket, the polished glasses, the table set with silver cutlery, all spoke of a different world, one of power, prestige, and wealth. But Mark, the titan of industry, blended effortlessly into the background. A man whose billion-dollar empire was cloaked under the guise of a regular customer. Mark relished moments like this. Moments when no one recognized him, when the world's business elite were not fawning at his feet, when he could just be another patron at a restaurant, hidden behind the anonymity of a hoodie and jeans. This was his playground, a place where he could test people, ordinary people, just to see how much they truly knew. It was a game for him, one where the stakes were always set high, but the consequences often went unnoticed. A jest, a challenge, a fleeting interaction that could turn into something extraordinary. On that crisp October evening in 2022, Mark had decided his target was Sharon Rosier, a black woman who served him his dinner. Her uniform gleamed under the soft lighting, and her poised demeanor suggested a sharp mind that was carefully concealed behind her waitress apron. To Mark, she was just another face. Just another person who would respond with a nervous laugh to his offhand remark. Just another person who might not know how to handle a billionaire's quip. But Sharon was different. With a slight grin, Mark raised his gaze to meet hers, his fingers tapping on his phone as he formulated his next challenge. "I'll have the financial advice with a side of sparkling water," he said nonchalantly, his voice dripping with playful arrogance. The words were designed to test, to provoke, to see how much Sharon really understood about the world of finance. Sharon paused, her pen hovering over the notepad, her expression a study in calm neutrality. For a brief moment, Mark saw a flicker of something more than just a trained response. Her eyes met his, unflinching, and her voice, steady and measured, replied, "I'm sorry, sir, but I don't believe that's on the menu. However, if you'd like some advice, I might be able to help." There was no surprise in her voice, no hesitation, and no sign of being thrown off by the unexpected request. Mark, momentarily thrown off balance by her composed reaction, found himself at a crossroads between amusement and curiosity. Most people would have laughed, joked along, or simply moved on. But Sharon's response had been a subtle challenge. She wasn't flustered. She wasn't playing the role of the submissive server. She was something else entirely. Mark's lips curled into a smile. Well played, he thought. Still, he wasn't one to back down, especially not to someone he considered an outsider in this polished, high-society world. He leaned back in his chair, giving her a thoughtful look, his mind working behind the veil of his casual demeanor. "All right, then. Let's test your financial prowess," he said, his voice laced with a hint of mockery. "Where would you invest $1 million? Pick a few things. No pressure." Sharon didn't flinch. Her hand remained steady, poised, as she scribbled something on her notepad. Mark could almost feel the tension in the air, like the quiet before a storm. And then she spoke. "I diversify about 40% into emerging market ETFs focused on sustainable energy, 30% in undervalued mid-cap stocks, 20% in municipal bonds for the tax advantages, and keep 10% liquid for opportunistic acquisitions." Mark blinked. For a moment, he didn't know how to react. His initial amusement faltered as Sharon's answer sank in. She hadn't just thrown out a vague suggestion. Her response was specific, detailed, and precise. She spoke with an air of authority that surprised him. This wasn't the casual throwaway comment he had expected, the nervous ramble of someone trying to appease a wealthy customer. The shock hit him in waves. She had crafted a strategy with the kind of depth that came from experience, knowledge, and understanding, not just a fleeting glance at the stock market. Her words hit him with an unexpected force, a wall of sharp clarity that made him question the assumptions he had made. This was no ordinary waitress. "Wow," Mark said, more to himself than to her. "That's surprisingly specific." His voice softened, the initial edge of mockery replaced with something else. Curiosity. Interest. He wasn't sure, but he couldn't deny the fact that he was now fully engaged in the conversation. Sharon's eyes didn't waver, and her expression remained neutral as ever. "I'm just offering my opinion, sir. If you'd like to know more, I can explain in detail, or perhaps you'd prefer to place an order." Her calmness, the ease with which she had turned his little jest into something real, was unnerving. Mark's mind raced. How could someone with her background, no doubt a regular server in a fancy restaurant, be so well-versed in such complex financial topics? Who is she really? He set his phone down, now completely disarmed by Sharon's intellect and poise. He leaned forward, his curiosity getting the better of him. "All right," he said, pushing aside his previous amusement. "I'll bite. Explain the emerging markets angle. What's your reasoning there?" Sharon glanced around at the bustling restaurant, noting the other tables she needed to attend to, then shifted her focus back to Mark. "Western markets are oversaturated with green investments, which causes a bubble effect," she began, her voice smooth and measured. "Developing nations, on the other hand, have more room to grow, especially in sustainable energy. There are fewer regulatory hurdles, and governments are actively seeking infrastructure investment. Tax incentives in those regions make the returns higher than in more established economies." Mark listened intently, his mind ticking as Sharon outlined her argument. There was a depth to her analysis that was undeniable. He had expected a simple, off-the-cuff response, a quick fix to satisfy his little game. But this wasn't a game anymore. He was genuinely intrigued. "So, what's the catch?" Mark asked, though the question came out more as a challenge than a question of disbelief. "Why are you working here if you know all this?" Sharon didn't flinch. She simply smiled faintly, the barest trace of amusement in her eyes. "Some of us aren't given the luxury of working in high-powered offices, Mr. Wilson. But I enjoy the work here. It pays the bills, and I get to meet interesting people." Mark's eyes narrowed, his instincts sharpening. She had just dropped a hint, but it was a subtle one. Sharon wasn't just another waitress. She was someone who had chosen this life for a reason, someone who had a past that was carefully guarded. Mark's gaze lingered on her for a moment longer than necessary, sensing there was more to her than the carefully constructed persona she presented. The silence stretched for a beat, and then Mark leaned back, studying Sharon with renewed interest. "You know, you're not what I expected," he said, his voice now stripped of its previous mockery. Sharon raised an eyebrow but didn't respond immediately. She gave him a moment, as if to savor the moment when the power dynamic shifted. "Thank you," she finally said, her tone cool but not dismissive. "Now, can I take your actual order, or do you have more financial questions?" The tension between them shifted once again, now laden with something deeper than casual conversation. Mark was no longer the wealthy CEO testing a waitress. Sharon had somehow flipped the script, and for the first time in a long time, Mark found himself feeling uncertain. "Fine," he said after a beat, his voice settling into something more genuine. "I'll have the steak rare, and a side of truffle mac and cheese, and sparkling water." As Sharon turned to leave, Mark's gaze followed her, his thoughts swirling. She had caught him off guard in a way he hadn't experienced in years. Who is she really? And as she walked away, her movements fluid and efficient, Mark's mind was already working, plotting. He wasn't going to let this encounter end here. Sharon was far more than just a waitress. The moment Sharon walked away, Mark leaned back in his chair, his gaze lingering on her as she moved efficiently between tables, effortlessly balancing the demands of a busy dining room. But he wasn't watching her out of mere curiosity anymore. No, something had shifted within him, a subtle but unmistakable sense of intrigue. His mind was racing, turning over the specifics of their conversation, trying to understand what had just unfolded. For a brief moment, he had thought she was just another server, another face in the restaurant with the same tired routine. But that was before she had launched into her pitch-perfect investment strategy. Before she had casually dropped knowledge that even his most seasoned advisors would struggle to articulate with such ease. He couldn't let it go. He needed to know more. He caught Sharon's eye as she passed by, her head slightly tilted in acknowledgement. Without missing a beat, he motioned for her to come over, his fingers tapping on the table in a rhythm that matched the pulse of his growing fascination. She paused, then, with an almost imperceptible sigh, walked back toward him. This time, however, there was a difference in the air between them. The dynamic had shifted from casual amusement to something much more serious. "I'm sorry," Mark said, his voice low and deliberate. "I've been thinking about what you said. You mentioned emerging markets and tax incentives. I'd like you to explain more. You have my full attention." Sharon hesitated, her hand gripping the notepad a little tighter. For a fleeting moment, Mark could see the wariness in her expression, the reluctance to go deeper, to divulge more than was comfortable. But then, she squared her shoulders and nodded. "All right, Mr. Wilson. You're asking about emerging markets." She set her pen down, standing a little straighter. "You see, the economies in developing nations present an untapped potential. The infrastructure is often underdeveloped, but that's also the opportunity. Emerging markets need sustainable energy sources, and they are actively seeking investment to build that infrastructure. It's like planting seeds in soil that's rich with possibility, but not yet fully cultivated." Mark leaned forward, his eyes sharp, listening intently. Her words weren't just abstract theories. They were grounded in facts, in trends that Mark knew well, but rarely heard articulated in such an accessible way. He was used to hearing complex financial terms tossed around, but this was different. Sharon had a way of making it feel real. She wasn't speaking from a textbook. She was speaking from a place of understanding, of lived knowledge. "And the tax incentives?" Mark asked, pushing forward, more out of curiosity than skepticism. "The incentives come from governments eager to foster foreign investment. Many of these nations offer tax breaks to investors in green energy projects, and the returns can be much higher than in more saturated markets. Of course, it's not without risk, but the potential is massive." Sharon's tone remained steady, but there was a subtle authority in her voice that made Mark feel the weight of her words. Mark studied her for a moment, his thoughts turning over what she had said. He had heard the buzz around emerging markets before, but never explained so simply, so directly. His mind flashed back to his own advisors, professionals with years of experience, who wouldn't have articulated that with the same clarity or conviction. The sheer rightness of her strategy hit him like a bell. "This isn't just textbook stuff," he murmured, almost to himself. He met her gaze and, for a moment, saw something deeper there, something beyond the calculated responses and composed professionalism. Sharon's expression softened, but there was still that underlying distance. "It's not," she said. "But I do need to get back to work." Mark, however, was not ready to let her go so easily. There was more to this conversation, more he needed to know. He wasn't about to let the chance slip by without understanding exactly who she was. "Hold on," he said quickly, gesturing for her to stay. "You're juggling tables, I know, but you've clearly got a lot more on your plate than just taking orders. Why don't you sit with me for a moment? I'll compensate you for your time." Sharon glanced around the restaurant, a flicker of hesitation crossing her features. She didn't want to be distracted from her work, and her professional demeanor remained unwavering. But something about Mark's insistence, the sincerity mixed with curiosity, compelled her to pause. "I'm fine standing," she replied evenly. But Mark could see the subtle way she shifted her weight, her reluctance still there, hidden beneath the surface. "No," Mark said, his voice firm but not unkind. "Sit. Please." Sharon bit her lip for a moment, caught between the professional distance she had carefully crafted and the pull of the conversation unfolding. It was a delicate balance, but Mark's words had pushed her past that invisible line. She took a breath and slid into the chair across from him, setting her notepad aside. Her posture was poised but tense, and for the first time, Mark saw something more than just the surface, a guardedness, an uncertainty. She had a story, he was certain of it, but she wasn't ready to share it yet. "All right," she said, folding her hands on the table. "What do you want to know?" Mark regarded her closely, sensing the underlying tension. "I'm intrigued," he said, leaning back. "You've got a way of talking about finance that feels... well, it feels like you're not just passing on surface-level knowledge. It's real. How did you get that kind of expertise?" For a moment, Sharon was silent. Her eyes flicked briefly to the other patrons in the restaurant, as if measuring the space between them and the life she had built here. Mark watched her closely, waiting for her answer, but she didn't offer any immediate response. He could feel her weighing the decision to open up, weighing how much of herself she was willing to expose. Finally, she sighed, the tiniest crack in her professional facade. "I have a background in finance," she said, her words clipped but confident. "I was studying economics before I had to take a break. Life happens." The words were simple, and yet there was so much more behind them. Mark could tell she wasn't revealing the full truth. There was something about her past that she was carefully protecting. But even with this guarded admission, Mark's curiosity flared, more intense than ever. "Studying economics," he repeated, almost incredulously. "And now you're working as a waitress? What happened?" Sharon shifted slightly in her seat, her expression hardening, but her voice remained even. "I didn't finish my degree. Sometimes, things happen and you have to make sacrifices. This is where I am now." Mark could tell she wasn't ready to go into detail. He didn't press further, but the seed of doubt had been planted in his mind. Sharon wasn't just some waitress. Her sharp intellect, the precision in her responses, her confident grasp of financial principles, there was more here than met the eye. She wasn't telling him everything, and that intrigued him even more. He scribbled something in his notebook, a faint smile playing on his lips as he looked at her. "Well, whatever the circumstances were, I can tell you one thing. Your financial mind is sharp. You've got a gift. If you ever decide to leave the restaurant business, I'm sure you'd do well in the field. Better than most." Sharon's eyes softened just slightly, a trace of appreciation in her gaze, but the walls remained firmly in place. "I appreciate that," she said, standing up. "But for now, I need to get back to work. People are waiting." Mark's hand froze over his notebook as he watched her walk away. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had just scratched the surface of something extraordinary, and that Sharon, or whoever she really was, had far more to offer than just casual financial advice. As Sharon moved away, Mark's mind raced. What was she hiding? Why was she here, in this restaurant, when she clearly had the expertise to do much more? Whatever it was, he knew he was far from finished with her. He would find out more. For now, though, he closed his notebook, his thoughts turning over the details she had shared. His game, it seemed, had just begun. The ambience in the restaurant had softened further as the evening stretched on, the golden lights casting a more intimate glow over the patrons. The hum of conversation, the clink of silverware against fine china, every detail seemed to fade away as Mark and Sharon sat across from one another, the distance between them closing with each passing minute. What had begun as a playful test on Mark's part was quickly evolving into something deeper, more serious. The game he'd started was no longer a mere jest. Mark leaned forward slightly, his gaze fixed on Sharon. She had yet to return to her usual, professional demeanor. Instead, she had leaned into their conversation, each word, each explanation, revealing more of herself. The walls she'd so carefully built up were beginning to crack, and Mark was ready to press further. He knew the more he understood about her, the more he could not only help her but also, selfishly, learn from her. "I have to say," Mark began, his tone shifting from the casual mockery that had started the evening, "you've impressed me. Your understanding of emerging markets, tax incentives. Hell, it's better than half the portfolios I've seen from my own advisors." He wasn't being flippant anymore. His voice was earnest. "What's your background? How do you know all this?" Sharon glanced down at the table for a moment, her fingers tapping lightly on the napkin tucked under her arm. Mark watched the movement, sensing a hesitation. She wasn't ready to give everything away. Not yet. But that's what intrigued him. She wasn't just a waitress, and he was beginning to understand that there was more to her than the practical knowledge she had shared. "I told you before," she said, lifting her gaze to meet his, her voice steady. "I studied finance." Mark smiled faintly, his curiosity piqued. "Studied?" Past tense. Sharon's lips twitched, a fleeting, almost imperceptible smile that quickly disappeared. "Yes. Past tense. I had big plans once. I was on track for a good career, a real future in the field. But life doesn't always cooperate, does it?" Her words hung in the air, her tone neutral, but there was an unmistakable undercurrent to them, a subtle weight that made Mark pause. This wasn't just a professional conversation anymore. Sharon had inadvertently opened a door to something more personal, and Mark couldn't help but step through it. "Life doesn't," he echoed softly, his eyes never leaving hers. "What happened?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, her gaze drifted to the far corner of the restaurant, where a couple dined, laughing softly over a glass of wine. The distraction was brief, a moment of contemplation, and then she turned back to him. "It's not the kind of thing you discuss with customers," Sharon said with a small, wry smile, though her eyes had darkened. "But since you insist, let's just say I had to put my life on hold. I had to take care of things at home." Mark frowned, sensing the shift in the tone of their conversation. The change was subtle, but it was there. "What kind of things?" he pressed, his voice low, almost a whisper now. He had pushed too far already. He could see that, but his curiosity had evolved into something deeper. Sharon exhaled slowly, her posture stiffening just a fraction, as if preparing herself for something difficult. She didn't want to talk about it. Mark could tell. But there was something in her, some quiet fire, that told him she wasn't about to back down from a challenge. She'd been through enough. "Family," she said simply, her voice soft. "A crisis. I was forced into waitressing after. Well, things fell apart. People have their lives planned out, right? You go to school, get a job, move forward. But when the ground shifts beneath you, you have to adapt, don't you?" Her words were sharp, laced with a truth that had been hard-earned. The professional distance she kept had given way to something more vulnerable, but Mark knew better than to push too much. He let her speak in her own time. "Sometimes the only way to survive is to step back," Sharon continued, her voice low but steady. "And I had to put my own future on pause to handle things at home. That's why I'm here. Waitressing wasn't the plan, but it was a way to keep going when nothing else made sense." She paused for a moment, glancing at her notepad. Not everyone gets a second chance. Mark could feel the weight of her words settle over him. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected Sharon to let him in so quickly. But now that she had, he felt the beginnings of something new, something that went beyond their previous conversation. Her past wasn't just a series of events to be glossed over. It was a story of survival, of strength. Mark shifted in his seat, leaning forward. "You sound like someone who's been through a lot. But you didn't let it defeat you. You've kept going." Sharon gave him a look, an unreadable expression. It was the kind of look that made Mark wonder if she was questioning her decision to reveal so much. She didn't respond immediately, and he wasn't sure if she ever would. "Not everyone has the same luck," Sharon said, her voice colder now, like a protective layer was falling back into place. "But it doesn't mean you give up. You find a way. It's that simple." Mark couldn't help but be impressed. He'd encountered a lot of people in his life. Billionaires, CEOs, self-made moguls, but there was something raw and real about Sharon's resilience. She wasn't looking for sympathy, and she wasn't playing a victim. She was simply acknowledging the truth of her situation. The change in her demeanor wasn't lost on Mark. He had been probing, trying to understand her, but now he understood something more fundamental. Her guardedness wasn't just a defense. It was a necessary armor, one she had put on long ago to survive. And though she had let him see a crack in that armor, she wasn't about to let it all crumble just yet. "So, what now?" Mark asked, breaking the silence, his voice genuine, not laced with the usual games. "What happens when you get your second chance?" Sharon's eyes flickered, a spark of something. Hope, maybe, flickering behind the wall she had so carefully erected. But before she could answer, a voice from across the room interrupted them. It was the maitre d', who had been watching the interaction with a careful eye. "Excuse me, Ms. Rosier," the maitre d' called, his tone respectful but urgent. "Table 12 needs a refill." Sharon straightened, instantly slipping back into her role as a waitress. It was as if the switch had been flipped once again. She smiled politely, nodding at the maitre d', before looking back at Mark. "I'll have to go," she said softly, standing up, her professionalism reinstated like a shield. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Wilson. I've got work to do." Mark didn't want to let her go. The conversation had shifted in a way he hadn't anticipated, and now that he'd glimpsed something deeper in Sharon, he didn't want to lose that connection. He reached for his wallet, pulling out a crisp, oversized bill, and set it on the table. "Don't worry about it," he said, his voice quieter now. "You've already given me more than I expected." Sharon's gaze flicked to the bill, but she didn't take it immediately. She seemed to consider it for a long moment, then slowly nodded. "Thank you, but I'll let you know if I need anything," she said, her tone professional once more. "Have a good evening, Mr. Wilson." She turned, walking away with the same fluid grace, her movements graceful but purposeful. Mark watched her go, feeling the sense of curiosity deepen into something more. A need to understand her, not just as a financial analyst or a waitress, but as the person she truly was. As Sharon reached the other side of the restaurant and started to tend to her other tables, Mark felt the remnants of the night settle in. The enigma that was Sharon Rosier, no, Sharon, remained, unresolved and yet fascinating. And with each passing moment, Mark's sense of respect for her only grew. He scribbled a note in his notepad, capturing the essence of their conversation, his thoughts a mixture of intrigue and something more. He wasn't done with her. Not by a long shot. Sharon's past had been one of survival, and though she was hiding parts of herself from him, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that she was about to become much more than just a fascinating challenge. The evening carried on, and Mark couldn't shake the sense that he had just stepped into uncharted territory. He had spent years manipulating situations, testing people, shaping outcomes to his advantage. But this time, something was different. Sharon wasn't someone who could be easily figured out, not with a quick jab at her professional knowledge or a casual exchange. She had turned the tables, and Mark was now the one on the defensive. He sat in the same corner, his phone resting idly in his hand. The meal had long since been consumed, but his thoughts were elsewhere. He watched Sharon from across the room, moving with the efficiency and precision of someone who knew how to handle the demands of her job. Yet, beneath that composed exterior, Mark could sense there was more. She wasn't just serving tables. She was playing a different game, one that he hadn't even realized he was a part of. The moment Sharon had left him earlier, he'd felt the weight of the conversation shift. He couldn't let it end like that. No, he needed to know more. His curiosity, which had initially been sparked by a simple jest, had deepened into something more. Sharon wasn't just another waitress. She was someone who had hidden her potential beneath layers of assumed insignificance. And Mark couldn't resist peeling back those layers. His decision was swift. He rose from the table, scanning the room for the maitre d'. With a wave of his hand, he motioned the man over. "I need to speak with Ms. Rosier," Mark said. "When she's done, please send her over here. And tell her I'll be compensating her for her time." The maitre d' nodded, clearly unfamiliar with the request but accustomed to the eccentricities of the clientele. Mark returned to his seat, tapping his fingers against the table as he waited. The thought of the conversation that was to come sent a ripple of anticipation through him. This wasn't just about business anymore. It was about understanding Sharon, figuring out who she really was and why she'd buried herself under the guise of waitressing. A few minutes later, Sharon approached, her steps measured, but her expression was more guarded than before. Mark couldn't help but notice the subtle tension in her posture. She was no longer the confident, composed woman he had engaged with earlier. Something had shifted, and he could sense it. "Mr. Wilson," Sharon said, her voice steady but with a note of caution. "You wanted to speak with me?" Mark looked up from his seat, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that surprised even him. Please sit down, he gestured to the chair across from him. I've been thinking about our conversation earlier, and I wanted to extend an offer. I'm willing to pay you for your time tonight. Off the clock. A chance to talk more, if you're willing. Sharon hesitated for a moment, her gaze flicking to the other tables, her professional instincts clearly at war with her curiosity. But Mark's words, and the offer of compensation, lingered in the air like an unspoken challenge. She gave a small nod and slid into the seat, her posture shifting as she leaned back slightly, a gesture that suggested her walls were rising once again. You're not the first to offer me money for my time, Sharon said, her tone even, but there was a certain sharpness to it now. But I'll bite. What do you want to talk about? Mark smiled, a slow, deliberate curve of his lips. You're clever. I like that. He leaned forward slightly, the shift in the power dynamic palpable. I'm curious, Sharon. You're not just a waitress, are you? That's not all there is to you. Not by a long shot. She met his gaze, her eyes flickering for just a moment, before she masked whatever emotion was there. You're right, Mr. Wilson, Sharon said, her voice cool and measured. I'm more than that. But everyone needs a job. This one's paying the bills. Mark nodded, but there was something else in her words, something deeper than simple pragmatism. I'm sure it is, he said slowly, leaning back in his chair. But I suspect you didn't end up here by choice. You've got skills, talent, insights that go far beyond this restaurant. And I'm not just talking about the financial knowledge you dropped on me earlier. Sharon stiffened slightly, but she didn't shy away from his gaze. I'm not sure what you're getting at, Mr. Wilson, she replied, her words precise, her walls firmly back in place. Mark chuckled softly. Don't play coy. I know what you did earlier wasn't just instinct. You were testing me as much as I was testing you. The way you broke down those markets, how you spotted the opportunities. It's something I don't come across every day. And it's not the kind of thing someone in your position just knows offhand. Sharon's eyes narrowed ever so slightly, a hint of defiance in her gaze. I've read a lot. Worked hard to understand the world around me. She was keeping things vague, and Mark could sense the hesitation there. She wasn't offering up any more than she needed to, but her tone had changed. There was a challenge there now, one that Mark was willing to meet head-on. So, let's get down to it, Mark said, his voice steady but tinged with an edge of curiosity. You're hiding something, aren't you? Sharon's eyes flashed for a brief moment, and Mark caught it. There was a flicker of something in her expression, a guarded pain that she quickly masked. Everyone's hiding something, Mr. Wilson. We all have our secrets. The shift in the air was palpable. Mark leaned forward again, his eyes intense. I wasn't asking for everyone's secrets, Sharon. Just yours. You've got potential. I see it. And I'm willing to help you. But first, I need to understand who you really are. For the first time that evening, Sharon's mask faltered, her gaze flicking away for just a moment before she steadied herself. She was silent, contemplating his words, weighing whether to reveal more. Finally, she spoke, her voice low and deliberate. I didn't end up here by choice, she said, her words clipped, but there was a vulnerability in them that Mark hadn't heard before. I had a life once. A future. But things went wrong. And sometimes you just have to survive, you know? Mark nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. I get it. But you're more than just someone who's surviving. You're someone who's been through something. Someone who's come out the other side. And that's what makes you different. That's what makes me want to help you. Sharon exhaled sharply, her eyes darkening as she looked at him. You don't know the full story, Mr. Wilson. It's not something I want to share with anyone, least of all you. Mark's expression softened, but there was no mistaking the intensity in his gaze. I get that. But you're not going to make me stop asking. Sharon stood up suddenly, her chair scraping the floor with a soft sound. She collected her notepad, her professional mask slipping back into place. I'm not going to tell you everything, Mr. Wilson, she said, her voice firm, but there was a trace of something else. Something softer, almost vulnerable. I have my reasons. Mark watched her carefully as she turned to leave, but before she could walk away, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card. He placed it on the table, sliding it toward her with a deliberate gesture. "Then let's make a deal," he said, his voice steady but with an unmistakable undercurrent of intent. "You don't have to tell me everything, but I'd like to continue this conversation. We can meet outside of here. Talk business. Talk whatever you want. But I think you're someone worth investing in." Sharon hesitated, her hand hovering over the business card. For a moment, she seemed to consider it. Then, with a quiet exhale, she picked it up, slipping it into her pocket. She didn't say anything more, but the brief, almost imperceptible nod she gave him spoke volumes. "I'll think about it," she said quietly, before turning and walking away. Mark sat back in his chair, a slow smile creeping onto his lips. The power dynamic had shifted once again. He had been the one pushing for answers, but now he was the one left with questions. Sharon Rosier was an enigma, and Mark was determined to uncover the mysteries she hid behind that professional facade. And as the evening continued to unfold, he couldn't help but wonder, would she take the offer? Or was she already plotting her next move? The soft hum of the restaurant seemed to fade into the background as Mark waited, his fingers lightly tapping the table. Sharon had walked away from their conversation moments ago, but Mark's mind was still sharply focused on her. The depth of her knowledge, her poise under pressure, it had impressed him far more than any financial analyst he'd worked with in the past. This was no casual waitress. She was a woman with talent, hidden beneath a facade that she had carefully cultivated. Mark's instinct told him that this was the moment to make a move, to offer her an opportunity that could change everything for her. It was more than just curiosity now. He saw something in her, a potential that had been squandered by circumstance, a mind that had been trapped behind the wrong job, the wrong life choices. But Mark was in the business of unlocking potential, of seeing what others missed and turning it into something extraordinary. And for the first time in a long while, he felt the stirring of something beyond business, something that almost resembled hope. Sharon had returned to the other side of the restaurant, effortlessly gliding between tables, checking on her patrons with a kind of efficiency that came from years of practice. But even in the midst of all the activity, Mark could see the quiet intensity in her movements. She wasn't just performing her job. She was playing a role, one that had become second nature to her over time. He wasn't fooled by it. When the maitre d' came to check on him, Mark waved him off and stood up, making his way to the bar where Sharon had just served a glass of wine to another customer. Her back was to him, but she could sense his presence before he spoke. "Sharon," Mark said, his voice calm yet firm. "We need to talk." Sharon stiffened slightly, but she didn't turn around. Instead, she finished adjusting the wine glass before placing it on the counter, then slowly turned to face him. There was no trace of surprise, no indication that she was thrown off by his sudden approach. She was as composed as ever, though Mark could see the walls she had built between them. "I'm working," Sharon replied coolly, her tone neutral. "I know," Mark said with a slight smile. "But I think it's time we talked about something more serious. Something that could change everything for you." Sharon raised an eyebrow, her expression guarded. "Serious?" she echoed. "What's that supposed to mean?" Mark took a breath, the weight of his next words hanging heavily between them. He had already decided what he wanted. This wasn't about testing her anymore. This was about offering her something he knew she could never get from a restaurant job. He was giving her a way out, an escape from the life that had limited her. "I want to offer you a position," he said, locking eyes with her. "I want you to join my company as a consultant. I've seen your ability, your insights, your analysis. It's rare, Sharon. And I think it could be the key to taking this company to new heights." Sharon blinked, and for the first time, there was a flicker of something in her eyes. Surprise, uncertainty, maybe even disbelief. But she didn't speak immediately. Instead, she looked away, her gaze flickering briefly to the patrons at their tables. Mark pressed on, sensing her hesitation but not backing down. "I'm not offering you some cushy office job or a corner desk, Sharon. What I'm offering you is real financial freedom, the kind that gives you control over your life. You'll be a consultant. You'll work directly with me. No more waiting tables. No more pretending to be someone you're not. Sharon's eyes narrowed slightly, and Mark could see the gears turning in her mind. She was processing, weighing her options, but Mark knew this was a delicate moment. This wasn't just about money. Sharon had a history, a past that Mark suspected was far more complicated than she had let on. He wasn't sure what had happened to her, but he could sense that her desire for privacy ran deeper than a simple aversion to wealth or status. "You think I'm just going to drop everything and work for you?" Sharon asked, her voice tinged with skepticism. "Just like that?" Mark's smile faded slightly, replaced by a more serious expression. He knew the offer had to be tempting, but he also understood her reluctance. It wasn't about the job. It was about control and trust. "I'm not asking you to drop everything," Mark said softly. "I'm offering you the chance to work on your terms. You'll have the flexibility to maintain your privacy, but you'll also be making decisions that matter. This isn't just about the money. It's about freedom. Real freedom." Sharon glanced down at the counter, her eyes clouding with something Mark couldn't quite place. It was as though she was lost in a thought, or a memory, and Mark could sense the pull of it. Whatever her past held, it wasn't something she was ready to share. And that was fine. He wasn't asking her to spill her life story. But he had to prove to her that he wasn't just offering a way out. He was offering a way forward. "You've been living under the radar for a while," Mark continued, his voice steady. "But you don't have to anymore. You don't have to hide. You can take this opportunity and shape your own future. No one else has to decide it for you. Only you." Sharon's silence stretched between them, and for a moment, Mark felt the air grow thick with tension. She wasn't giving him the immediate yes he had hoped for. She was thinking, calculating perhaps, what this would mean for her. But Mark knew he couldn't rush her. Not now. Finally, Sharon looked up at him, her gaze sharp and calculating. "And what do you get out of this, Mr. Wilson?" she asked, her voice steady but edged with suspicion. "You just want to help me? Or is this some kind of experiment?" Mark's lips twitched. It was a valid question, one that he hadn't fully addressed. But he wasn't ashamed of his intentions. He had a genuine belief in Sharon's potential, and he wasn't afraid to admit it. "Honestly? Both," Mark said. "I see potential in you. And, yes, maybe there's a bit of an experiment involved. But that's how I operate. I look for untapped talent, for the things that others miss. You've got something rare, Sharon. I want to see where it can go." Sharon didn't reply immediately, but Mark could see the flicker of something in her expression, a recognition of his sincerity, maybe, or the simple acknowledgement of what was being offered. Her gaze fell to the business card in his hand, and she didn't take it immediately. Instead, she stood there, silent, the weight of the decision settling in her. "You want me to take this seriously," Sharon said quietly, her voice tight. "You want me to trust you. But there's a lot I need to know first. What kind of control do I have? What kind of assurances do I get?" Mark nodded, his expression softening. "Fair. You'll have complete control over your work. No one will dictate how you do things. You'll have the resources you need to make decisions, but you will make them. The only thing I'm asking is for you to work with me. Not for me. Work with me." Sharon seemed to consider this, her fingers tracing the edge of the business card he had placed on the counter. The moment felt heavy, pregnant with possibility. And yet, Mark knew that this wasn't just about the job offer. It was about Sharon taking a risk. "I'll think about it," Sharon said finally, her voice calm but tinged with uncertainty. "But I need time." Mark smiled, the satisfaction of her response settling over him. He wasn't expecting an immediate answer. He didn't want it. This was a decision that had to be made on her own terms. "Take all the time you need," Mark replied. "I'm not going anywhere." Sharon nodded and, with one last look at the business card, slipped it into her pocket. Without another word, she turned and walked back into the fray of the restaurant, her mind clearly in motion, calculating the weight of what he had offered. Mark watched her go, his heart still beating a little faster than normal. He wasn't sure where this would lead, but he knew one thing for certain: the offer was just the beginning. As Sharon disappeared into the crowd, Mark felt the gravity of the moment settle on him. She had taken the card, her silence a promise of consideration. But more than that, it was the promise of something changing. Something neither of them could predict, but something he was ready to navigate. For the first time in a long while, Mark was both hopeful and uncertain, two things that rarely coexisted within him. But whatever came next, he knew it would be something he wouldn't forget. And neither would Sharon. The restaurant was quieter now, the evening's rush ebbing away, leaving behind a softer hum. Sharon stood behind the bar, wiping down glasses and adjusting the rows of clean silverware. Her motions were automatic, but her mind was miles away, far beyond the flickering candlelight and the crisp white linens of the dining room. Mark's offer had landed like a weight in her chest, heavy with possibility, yet tangled with hesitation. As she worked, the clink of glasses and the soft murmur of patrons around her seemed muffled, as though the world was fading into the background. Sharon was left alone with her thoughts, her hands still moving but her mind replaying every word Mark had spoken. Join me as a consultant. Work with me, not for me. Financial freedom. Control. The words echoed in her head, reverberating in the silence of her small apartment when she closed her eyes. 4 years, she had been stuck in a job that, while paying the bills, offered little in terms of future or fulfillment. She had once dreamed of a life in finance, a career that would allow her to rise above the financial struggles that had gripped her family. But that dream had slipped through her fingers when tragedy struck. A family crisis, the kind that upended everything, had forced her hand. She had been left with no choice but to put her education and aspirations on hold. Waitressing became a survival tactic. It wasn't supposed to be permanent, but it had been. Now, Mark was offering her a way out, an opportunity that seemed too good to be true. It was everything she'd ever wanted, yet something inside her recoiled. She had lived with secrets for too long, things she had never shared with anyone, not even the closest people in her life. To trust someone again, to step into a world where she could be vulnerable, was terrifying. Could she really let go of her anonymity and embrace a life that demanded so much more of her? Her gaze drifted out the restaurant window, watching the city lights blur in the distance. The world beyond seemed so far away, yet here she was, caught between two realities, the one she had built for herself and the one Mark was offering. Sharon's thoughts were interrupted by a voice. One of her colleagues, a younger woman named Lily, had come up to her, a look of concern on her face. "Hey, you've been off for a while now," Lily said, nudging her arm lightly. "You okay?" Sharon smiled faintly, the tension in her shoulders easing just a little. "Yeah, just thinking about something." Lily raised an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced. "You've been distracted all night. You sure everything's all right?" Sharon nodded quickly, forcing a smile. "It's fine. Just, work stuff." But it wasn't just work. It was everything. The offer, her past, her future. They all intertwined like a tangled web, and the more she thought about it, the more she realized how much she had been holding on to. Her independence, her anonymity. They were all part of the life she had carefully crafted, one where no one could get too close. No one could see what she had hidden beneath the surface. "I get it," Lily said, pulling her out of her thoughts. "Don't let it get to you. Anyway, the table at the back needs a refill. They're asking for you." Sharon nodded, grateful for the interruption. She gathered herself, making her way back to the bustling dining area. The distractions of work, the chatter, the clinking of plates, all helped dull the noise in her head. For a while, she allowed herself to simply move through the motions, until the door opened, and Mark stepped inside. He was dressed casually again, wearing the same hoodie he'd had on during their last conversation. But this time, there was a weight to his presence, something that felt heavier than before. The ease with which he carried himself, the air of quiet authority, contrasted sharply with the relaxed clothes he wore. Mark's eyes scanned the room until they landed on Sharon, and for a moment, their gazes locked. The tension was palpable, the silent recognition between them unmistakable. Sharon felt her heart rate pick up, the internal struggle resurging as she approached him. The offer, still fresh in her mind, gnawed at her. How could she turn this down? But how could she trust it? He smiled, a quiet, knowing smile that didn't reach his eyes entirely, as if he were waiting for her response. He wasn't going to let this slide. Mark was no fool. He knew what he was offering her, and he wasn't about to let her walk away without a fight. "Sharon," Mark said, his voice warm but direct, "I've been waiting for you to consider my offer. And now that I've got your attention, I'd like to hear your thoughts. We can take this to the next level, whatever that means for you." Sharon felt the air around her tighten. Her mind was in overdrive, but she couldn't let him see the turmoil she was in. She couldn't let him see how much she was struggling with this decision. Her past, the things she had kept buried for so long, loomed over her like a shadow, threatening to consume her if she let it. "I've been thinking about it," Sharon said, her voice steady but her eyes betraying the conflict within her. "But there are a few things we need to discuss." Mark raised an eyebrow, his interest piqued. "Of course. Let's talk." She motioned for him to follow her to the quieter side of the restaurant, away from the noise of the other patrons. As they walked, she felt a flicker of nerves, but she couldn't afford to back down now. This was it, the moment when she would either step forward into the unknown or retreat into the safety of the life she had built. The uncertainty of that choice loomed large, but it was time to face it. Once they reached the back corner, Sharon turned to face him, her posture changing. She was no longer the waitress. She was someone asserting her boundaries, someone who had fought too hard to survive to let anyone walk over her. "You don't understand what this means for me," she said, her voice low but firm. "I've been living under the radar for a long time. I've kept my life small, kept my world small. You're asking me to step into a world that's not mine, to let go of my anonymity, to put my trust in someone I don't know. It's not that simple." Mark nodded slowly, his expression serious, understanding. "I get it. Trust isn't easy, especially when you've been burned before. But I'm not asking you to trust me blindly. I'm offering you something real, something that gives you control. You'll be the one making decisions, Sharon, not me." Sharon's jaw tightened. "Control is what I need. I need to know that I won't be just another pawn in your game. I need the assurance that my voice will matter, that I won't be overshadowed by the system you've built. I'm not here to be a token. I'm here to make a difference." Mark's gaze softened, and for the first time, there was a glimpse of something real behind his sharp, calculating exterior. "You'll have the control. I promise you that. The position is yours to shape however you want. But you'll need to trust me enough to step into this role." Sharon took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the decision pressing down on her. She had worked so hard to build a life where no one could touch her, where her past didn't matter. But now, Mark's offer was a lifeline, a chance to break free from the chains of her old life. Yet it was also a risk, and a part of her feared what might happen if she trusted him and it all fell apart. Mark reached into his pocket, pulling out the same business card he had given her before. He held it out to her, his eyes steady and earnest. "Take your time. Think about it. But don't let fear hold you back. You have everything it takes to make this work." Sharon hesitated for a moment, her fingers brushing against the card. Then, with a deep breath, she took it from his hand. Her gaze locked with his, and in that moment she knew. This wasn't just about a job. It was about everything, about moving forward, about claiming control of her own life. "I'll think about it," she said, her voice steady now, her resolve hardening. "But on my terms. If I do this, I do it my way." Mark nodded, a slight smile tugging at his lips. "I wouldn't have it any other way." As Sharon turned to leave, she felt the weight of the decision still hanging over her, but something had shifted within her. The boundaries had been set, the lines drawn. She wasn't just considering an offer. She was taking control of her own future. And with that, the chapter of her life that had been defined by survival began to shift. She was standing at the crossroads now, and for the first time in a long time, Sharon Rosier was ready to move forward, on her own terms. The days following their conversation felt like an intricate chess game, with every move carrying weight and every word measured. Mark couldn't shake the memory of Sharon. Despite her reservations, the business card he had given her now sat on his desk, A silent reminder of the untapped potential he had barely scratched the surface of. There was something in Sharon's eyes, something more than the sharp financial insights she had shared. She wasn't just playing a game of survival, there was strength beneath her guarded exterior, strength he had yet to fully understand. It gnawed at him. Mark was no stranger to digging into the pasts of those he was interested in. The truth behind a person's history was often the key to understanding their motivations, their limits, their potential. He wasn't just offering Sharon a chance at success. He was offering her a place in his world. And that meant knowing exactly who she was. Late one night, after another long day of back-to-back meetings and operational reports, Mark found himself scouring through the financial databases and records he had access to. He wasn't just looking for Sharon's past in public documents or through casual references. No, he needed something deeper. Something more revealing. He needed to understand why she had chosen to hide in plain sight. It didn't take long for Mark to uncover the key piece of Sharon's past. A degree in finance from a well-known university. It wasn't the kind of education one would expect from someone who had been working as a waitress for so long. Her transcripts, neatly tucked away in a database he had access to, confirmed it. She had been a star student. A top performer, with impressive marks in advanced economic theory, market analysis, and corporate strategy. She had the intellect to match any of his high-powered advisors. But that wasn't what stood out the most. The records showed a break. A gap that didn't make sense. There was no continuity, no sign of progression. It wasn't just a career derailment, it was a personal tragedy that had steered her life off course. Mark sifted through a few more documents and found what he was looking for. Sharon's mother had been diagnosed with a terminal illness just after Sharon's graduation. The documents hinted at family struggles, her mother's declining health, and the decision Sharon had made to step away from her career to care for her. The last entry on her resume was a bold decision to enter the workforce. Not in a financial firm, but at a restaurant. Her choices had been driven by love and necessity, not ambition. Mark sat back in his chair, a mix of admiration and regret filling him. This wasn't a simple career interruption. It was a story of sacrifice, a story of resilience. Sharon hadn't just been forced into waitressing. She had chosen it because it allowed her to live a life of integrity. She hadn't walked away from her dreams for lack of will or capability. She had done it for family, for responsibility. A deep respect for her began to take root in Mark's chest, one that went beyond professional admiration. He now saw Sharon not just as an untapped resource, but as someone who had been tested by fire and had come out the other side stronger for it. The next day, Mark reached out to Sharon. His request was simple. Meet him again. But this time, he would approach her differently. Not with the same game-playing attitude, but with a genuine intent to understand. To connect. When Sharon arrived, her gaze was guarded, but there was a subtle change in her posture, more sure than before. She wasn't just stepping into this meeting as a waitress anymore. She was stepping in as someone who had already made up her mind. She had her own agenda now. Mark, Sharon said, her voice steady as she sat down across from him. You wanted to talk? Mark nodded, his expression serious. I've been thinking a lot about our conversation. And I want to apologize. I didn't fully understand what you've been through, Sharon. The life you've had to build. It's not something I could have anticipated. Sharon's eyes narrowed, a flash of something unreadable flickering in them. Apology accepted, I guess, she said, her tone still cool but not as distant as before. But I'm not here for your sympathy, Mark. I'm here for a deal. You made an offer. I'm not interested in you trying to fix me or make things right. I'm just looking for a fair opportunity. Mark's chest tightened at her words, but he didn't flinch. He knew she wasn't looking for pity. She had made that clear from the start. You're right, he said. I'm offering you a way forward. But I'm not going to pretend I understand everything you've gone through. I just want to offer you a chance to take control again. To finally do what you were meant to do. Sharon leaned back slightly in her chair, crossing her arms. Control, she echoed softly. That's the word, isn't it? Everyone talks about it like it's some magical thing you can just take. But what does control really mean, Mark? For you, it's about power. But for me, It's about independence. It's about making sure I'm never in a position where someone else is in charge of my life again. Mark swallowed, his gaze never leaving hers. I understand, he said quietly. And I'm not asking you to give up your independence. I'm offering you a partnership. Control of your own future, but with the resources to back you up. There was a long pause as Sharon regarded him. The words partnership and control lingered between them, heavy with the weight of everything unspoken. Then Sharon spoke, her voice calm but unmistakably assertive. I'll agree to your offer, but I'm setting terms. No more games, Mark. I've been through too much to play at this anymore. If I join you, I need to know that I'm not just a figurehead in a business deal. I'm not here to play your sidekick. I'm here to be a force. You'll have to respect that. You'll have to let me work the way I need to. Mark listened intently, her words sinking in. That's fair. I'm not trying to control you, Sharon. I've seen what you can do, and I want you to have the space to do it. Sharon didn't smile, but the tension in her shoulders seemed to ease, and Mark saw a flicker of something, trust perhaps, pass between them. She had taken the reins of the conversation, her assertiveness setting the tone. For the first time since they'd started talking, Mark felt like he was the one being led, not the one in control. Then we're clear, Sharon said, her voice firm. We'll meet, but on my terms. I'll need you to provide the resources, but I'll need to retain full autonomy in how I use them. I'll decide where to focus, and I'll decide who I work with. If you can agree to that, we can move forward. If not, then this ends here. Mark nodded, a slow smile tugging at his lips. He respected her. He had underestimated her, but not anymore. Done, he said. You have full autonomy. This is your project, Sharon. I'm just here to provide the tools. How you use them is up to you. Sharon's eyes softened, but the wariness still lingered. She wasn't naive. She wasn't about to trust him fully just because he'd made a promise. But this was a start. A real start. I'll hold you to that, she said quietly, standing up. But now you know this is me, Mark. No more hiding. Mark stood with her, his respect for her deepening. I wouldn't have it any other way. Sharon paused at the door, then turned back to face him. I'll be in touch, she said, her tone decisive. And with that, she was gone, leaving Mark standing in the middle of the room, feeling a shift in the air. The tables had turned. This was no longer just about offering an opportunity. Sharon had taken control of the situation. She had set the terms. And for the first time, Mark realized that she was the one holding the power. As he sat back down at the table, a sense of anticipation gripped him. This partnership, this new chapter, was going to be different. It was going to be shaped by Sharon's resilience, her intellect, and her unyielding determination. And Mark, for all his resources, was now the one who would have to learn from her. The game was on, and Sharon was playing it on her own terms. The soft clinking of glasses and the muted conversations around them seemed to fade into the background as Sharon and Mark sat across from each other at the corner table. The evening was winding down, and the restaurant's ambience, with its warm lighting and quiet elegance, felt almost surreal against the weight of the conversation they were about to have. Mark had invited Sharon back to finalize the details of their agreement, and despite the casual atmosphere, both of them knew this meeting was anything but ordinary. The air between them was thick with anticipation. Sharon had set her terms, clearly defining the boundaries she needed to feel safe, respected, and in control of her future. Mark, in turn, had agreed to those terms, without hesitation, which was surprising in itself. He had seen potential in her from the start, but now, as he looked at her, there was something more, admiration. Sharon wasn't just a talented strategist. She was someone who knew exactly what she needed, and more importantly, wasn't afraid to demand it. The contract they were about to draft would solidify everything, their professional relationship, her autonomy, and the promise of what Mark could offer, a platform for Sharon to unleash her potential. It wasn't just about the job anymore. It was about reclaiming a life Sharon had been forced to abandon years ago, rebuilding from the ground up with strength, resilience, and her own terms. Mark placed a thick, leather-bound folder on the table between them. The document inside was simple, at least in structure. But every clause, every word, had been carefully considered, reflecting the delicate balance of trust and control Sharon had insisted upon. He opened it, glancing at the pages before looking up at Sharon. "I've made the adjustments," Mark said, his voice steady. "It's all here. Complete control for you, Sharon. But with the resources to back you up." Sharon nodded slowly, her gaze fixed on the papers. She had studied the document thoroughly before this meeting, but now, in the soft glow of the restaurant's lighting, it felt more like a ritual than a negotiation. The gravity of what they were about to do wasn't lost on her. This contract wasn't just a formal agreement. It was a marker of the shift in power that had occurred between them. "What about the non-compete clause?" Sharon asked, her voice cutting through the silence. "I want to make sure that if I leave or want to work with other clients, I can do that without restrictions. I've been held back too long." Mark didn't hesitate. "That's in there. You're free to work with whomever you choose. This isn't about locking you down, Sharon. It's about giving you freedom, the same way I promised. Your independence won't be compromised." Sharon's eyes flickered briefly toward him. She was sharp, always assessing, but for the first time since they'd started this exchange, she allowed herself a small nod of approval. She hadn't expected him to be this agreeable, but Mark's sincerity was becoming evident. He wasn't just trying to get what he wanted. He was genuinely offering her the space to make her own choices. "We're on the same page then," Sharon said, her tone more relaxed but still filled with the precision that had marked their earlier conversations. "I'll need clear limits on how much control you have in terms of decision-making. I'll need autonomy over how I structure my team and what kind of projects I take on. If you want results, you'll need to trust me to do what I do best." Mark met her gaze, his respect for her deepening with each passing moment. "I trust you, Sharon. That's why I'm here. You've got more than just the skills to make this work. You've got the vision, and that's what we need." Sharon picked up the pen, her fingers brushing the sleek, polished surface of it. She wasn't ready to sign just yet, but she felt the weight of the moment. This was the point of no return. Once she put her signature on that paper, everything would change. She wasn't just a waitress anymore. She wasn't just someone hiding in the shadows of her past. She was about to step into a future where she would have control. Real, undeniable control over her life and her work. "Mark," Sharon said, her voice steady. "I'm not doing this just for the opportunity. I'm doing this because I believe in my abilities. I've put my dreams on hold for too long, and I'm not about to let anyone take that away again. If I'm going to work with you, I need you to understand one thing. This is a partnership, not a mentorship, not a hierarchy. I need you to respect that." Mark's expression softened, and he leaned forward slightly, his hands resting on the edge of the table. "I understand completely, and you'll have the respect you deserve. This is about us working together, not me dictating how you do your job." Sharon looked down at the contract one more time, running her fingers over the terms she had carefully scrutinized. Everything was in order. There were no hidden clauses, no fine print that could trap her later. This was it, the opportunity she had been waiting for. And the more she thought about it, the more it felt like a fresh start. No longer would her past hold her back. No longer would she be defined by what had happened to her, but by what she could create moving forward. "All right," she said finally, her voice resolute. "I'll sign. But we're doing this on my terms. And don't forget it." Mark smiled, the hint of approval in his eyes. "I wouldn't dream of forgetting it." As Sharon picked up the pen and brought it to the paper, the sound of the ink scratching across the page felt almost ceremonial. It wasn't just a signature. It was a declaration. A declaration that Sharon was no longer a passive participant in her own life. She was taking control, carving her own path, and stepping into a future that was all her own. The restaurant around them, with its polished silver and flickering candlelight, seemed to fade into the background as the significance of the moment settled in. Sharon signed her name, the finality of it settling over her like a weight lifting from her shoulders. She had made her decision. She wasn't going to hide anymore. She wasn't going to play small. This was her chance to do things on her own terms, to create a future she could be proud of. Mark reached for his own pen, signing the document with the same confidence, his eyes never leaving Sharon. The respect he had for her was now palpable, and he knew, deep down, that this partnership would be unlike anything he had ever experienced. It wasn't just about business. It was about a shared vision, a mutual understanding of what could be accomplished when two people truly respected each other's strengths. The deal was done. But as the pen left the paper, neither of them spoke. There was an understanding between them that went beyond words. It was the acknowledgement of what they had just signed. An agreement, yes, but also a beginning. For Sharon, it was more than just a contract. It was the key to unlocking the future she had long dreamed of, a future where she would no longer be defined by her past but by what she chose to become. For Mark, it was a recognition of someone who had once been hidden and overlooked, but who now stood beside him as an equal, with the power to shape their shared destiny. Sharon set the pen down slowly, her eyes meeting Mark's one last time. "Let's make this work, Mark," she said, her voice steady but full of intent. "On my terms." Mark's smile was small but genuine. "I wouldn't have it any other way." As they both stood, the weight of the contract now behind them, Sharon felt a sense of finality settle over her. This was the beginning of something new, a chapter where she was no longer just surviving, but thriving. And as she walked out of the restaurant, the sound of her footsteps echoed in the quiet night air, each step a reminder that the past was no longer holding her back. This was her future, and she was ready to claim it. The city skyline stretched before Sharon like a canvas waiting to be painted. The view from Mark's office was breathtaking, but it was more than the glass walls that captured her attention. It was the way the world seemed to open up, full of endless possibilities and opportunities, each as vast and uncertain as the sky above. This was her first day as a consultant in Mark's company, and she felt the weight of it settle over her like the rising sun. The world she had once known, the restaurant with its familiar hum, its plates clattering, its patrons' voices blending into the background, now felt distant. Sharon had moved beyond it, and the realization stirred something inside her, a quiet triumph. She had made it. But today wasn't just about marking the end of one chapter. It was about stepping into something entirely new. Something that required every ounce of confidence she had developed over the years. She had spent too long hiding behind the safety of a life dictated by circumstances. Now, she was stepping into a world where she could define the rules. Sharon glanced around the sleek, modern office, her gaze landing on the large conference table where her first meeting was about to take place. Mark had warned her that the environment was fast-paced and demanding, but he had also promised her the freedom to shape her role. The team assembled here, the heads of various departments, the people who had once seemed like untouchable figures in Mark's empire. Today, they were her colleagues. She felt a flicker of nervousness in her chest, but she quickly smothered it. "No room for hesitation," she reminded herself. "I belong here." The door opened, and Mark walked in, his usual casual demeanor a stark contrast to the polished environment of the office. He wore a simple black shirt and slacks, no suit, no tie, his casual look a testament to the freedom he had created in his company. As always, there was something about him, his presence, that made everything feel in motion like a silent force that pulled people toward action. "Ready for your first meeting?" Mark asked, his voice steady, but there was a hint of approval in his eyes as he looked at her. Sharon took a breath, straightened her back, and nodded. "Let's do this." The meeting itself was a blur of numbers, strategies, and discussions that felt both foreign and familiar. Sharon listened intently, taking in the intricate details of the business, the way Mark's team navigated through ideas with precision. They spoke with ease, confident in the foundation they had built. But Sharon didn't feel out of place. In fact, as she contributed her insights, calmly, clearly, she realized how much of this world she already understood. The same skills that had once been used to navigate the volatile world of finance were now at her disposal. She was no longer the outsider. She was part of the conversation. She didn't just sit in the room. She moved in it. Her words carried weight, and the others responded to her insights with respect. As the meeting progressed, she felt the power of her position settling into place. She wasn't just consulting on the periphery. She was shaping decisions. At the end of the meeting, Mark turned to her with a smile. "Well done. That was impressive." Sharon gave a small nod, the rush of the meeting still settling in her veins. "Thank you, but there's a lot more to do." Mark raised an eyebrow, his expression appreciative. "That's the spirit." As the team filed out, Sharon remained at the table for a moment, staring out of the window. The view was mesmerizing, but it wasn't the skyline she was looking at. She was reflecting on how far she had come, on how much she had fought for this moment. She had made a decision years ago not to let circumstances define her future. She had stepped out of the shadows, and now she was here, in this high-rise, with a city sprawling out before her. Her past, the tragedy, the sacrifice, the years of waiting tables, wasn't something she could erase. But it was no longer the chain that bound her. It was the foundation upon which she had built her strength. Today, she stood on that foundation, looking at a future that was hers to shape. Later that evening, Mark sat in his office, reviewing documents and preparing for the next phase of their partnership. His mind, however, wasn't on the numbers. It was on Sharon, on the way she had transformed before his eyes. He had expected her to be good, even great. But what he hadn't anticipated was how quickly she had adapted to the world he had built. She hadn't just stepped in, she had commanded the room. Mark leaned back in his chair, his gaze lingering on the stack of papers in front of him. Sharon had been more than just a financial mind. She had become a catalyst for change. When he had first met her, it had been a game, a test to see if she was worth his time. He had assumed he would play the role of mentor, guiding her into this world. But what had transpired over the past few weeks was nothing like he had expected. Sharon wasn't just following along, learning from him. She was challenging him. She was reshaping the way he thought about business, about strategy, about leadership. He hadn't anticipated that her wisdom would make him rethink his own approach. Sharon had a sharpness to her that cut through the typical corporate noise. She wasn't just offering solutions. She was asking questions, probing, digging deeper, demanding better answers. And it was that very quality, the resilience to fight for her vision, that made her invaluable to him. He hadn't realized it at first, but he respected her. He respected the way she carried herself with such quiet strength, the way she took charge of her future with determination. He had watched her from the sidelines, and now, as they worked together, it was clear. This wasn't just about business. It was about the partnership they were building. Mark's thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. He turned as Sharon stepped inside, her posture as confident as ever. "Good evening," she said, a small smile on her lips. "I wanted to talk about some of the next steps for the team." Mark nodded, gesturing for her to take a seat. "Let's go over it." As Sharon outlined her ideas for the next phase of their projects, Mark listened intently, his mind still processing the way she had handled everything. She was decisive, clear, and unafraid to challenge the status quo. They weren't just building a business together. They were building something more. This wasn't just a mentorship. It was a partnership of equals, one where both of them brought their strengths to the table. Later that night, Sharon stood at her apartment window, gazing out at the city lights. The streets below were busy, the hum of life continuing on as usual. But for her, everything had shifted. She wasn't just an observer anymore. She was an active participant in the world she had once thought was out of reach. The reflection in the glass was no longer of a woman hiding behind a mask of normalcy. It was the reflection of someone who had fought for her place in the world, who had stepped into a future she had only dreamed of. Sharon was no longer defined by her past. She had forged a new path, one where she controlled her destiny. Her phone buzzed with a message from Mark. "Great work today. Let's keep this momentum going. I'm looking forward to what comes next." Sharon smiled softly, the message simple but meaningful. She had come so far, but this was only the beginning. There were still challenges ahead, still battles to fight. But for the first time in years, Sharon felt ready. The future was unwritten, but it was hers to shape. As she turned away from the window, her gaze lingered on the empty space ahead. The possibilities were endless, and Sharon knew one thing for sure. This was just the beginning. Her future was unwritten, but it was no longer uncertain. It was a future where she could rise to her full potential, a future where she could leave her past behind and step into a world she now commanded on her own terms. And as she moved forward, she knew there would be challenges, there would be risks, but there would also be triumphs. Sharon was ready, and the city, with all its promise, was waiting for her to make her mark.
Thank you for staying with me until the very end of this incredible journey. If this story touched your heart, wait until you see what's coming next. It's even more powerful and inspiring than you can imagine. So don't go anywhere. Click on that video showing on your screen right now to dive into another amazing story that will absolutely blow your mind. Trust me, you won't regret it.